I don't get too many opportunities to talk about it on this channel, but I've been a pretty big Dragon Ball fan for all my life, and every so often, here and there, I have done some Dragon Ball related videos, and every time I do, it's a fun topic to talk about. A few years back, I covered all the Dragon Ball games that were released on the GBA, and considering how I covered the Sonic handheld games, it only makes sense to do the same with Dragon Ball. So I decided to continue that format and do the next topic in line, covering all the Dragon Ball games that were released for the Nintendo DS. Actually, before starting this video, I didn't really realize how many came out during the DS's life. Basically all of which I missed out on, and all of which are totally new to me. We're going in blind. So today, let's take a look at every Dragon Ball game that was released for the Nintendo DS. But first, I want to take a minute to talk about this video's sponsor, Aura.
Have you ever Googled yourself and realized that there's more personal information of you made public than you probably would have liked? Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers, and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live. And frankly, that's none of their business. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they make it super hard to do. Let Aura handle that for you. Aura also does so much more to protect you and your family from online threats you can't see. And it's really easy to set up, so you don't need to download several different apps to get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. You get everything at one affordable price. And speaking of, you can try Aura free for 2 weeks using my link on screen or in the description. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online so you can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. You can either let people continue to exploit and profit off your private information, or you can go to aura.com/gilly to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. So if you've seen any of my other videos with a similar format, this won't surprise you. But for those here for the first time, it's pretty simple. I'm going to be covering every Dragon Ball game for the DS in chronological order, but only main titles count. So I won't be covering any spin-offs or games featuring multiple IPs, like Jump Superstars, for example. Only games whose titles actually feature the Dragon Ball name. With all that out of the way, let's dive in. In my GBA Dragon Ball games video, I covered a fighting game called Dragon Ball Z Supersonic Warriors, and it actually impressed me quite a bit. After playing through some lackluster games, Supersonic Warriors was a breath of fresh air. It controlled well, had an interesting story mode, and had some really cool sprite scaling that gave the fights some extra depth. Well, in 2005, a sequel was released for the Nintendo DS. Luckily, the game doesn't really utilize the second screen, so it's just a normal single-screen fighting game, saving the bottom screen for menus and such. So much like its predecessor, Supersonic Warriors 2's main mode— that's weird, Supersonic Warriors 2's? Alright, anyway, the main mode is story mode, obviously. It has a handful of other modes like Z-Battle mode, where you choose a team of 3 characters and face off against various other teams in a tournament setup. Versus Battle mode, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can play against a friend if they have a DS and a copy of the game. Free Battle mode, which is a free battle mode, and practice mode, which consists of 2 sub-modes. Training, where you fight against basically a dummy character, and tutorial, where you play as Gotenks and various characters teach you the controls. There's also a hard mode, which can be unlocked once you complete Z-Battle mode, but really, all of this pretty much amounts to different flavors of quick play. The main meat and potatoes here is story mode, and just like the first game in the series, it follows the events of Dragon Ball from the perspective of whichever character you pick. However, this time around, there's branching paths which can be taken that unlock what-if scenarios, or little side stories. Beating each match advances you through the main path, but branches can be unlocked by finishing matches under certain conditions, like not taking damage, beating them in a certain time limit, etc. As you make your way through each story mode, new characters gradually get unlocked, some for use solely in versus modes, and others which unlock brand new story mode campaigns. This time around, the controls and overall gameplay is relatively similar, but Supersonic Warriors 2 brings a new mechanic into the mix. Now, some battles you play as one character or another, but others are actually tag team matches, where you can either swap between fighters mid-match, or swap out for your backup fighter if you happen to get KO'd. Sometimes there's even a third support character thrown in, which you can activate to jump in and fire off support attacks during a fight. There's also a new mechanic where if certain conditions are met, like specific characters fighting together with a minimum amount of ki built up, you can initiate a team art, which is basically a dual attack where both of your fighters fire off an ultimate attack, severely depleting your opponent's health bar. As you play, more and more of these abilities become unlocked along with your typical special move fare. Now, apparently, reception in Japan for Supersonic Warriors 2 was really positive, citing the tag team mechanic as a big selling point and praising it as a better entry than its predecessor. In the US, though, it received pretty average reception, knocking it for its underutilized touch controls, as well as the sprites not being quite up to snuff. Apparently, people criticize the game for not using the touchscreen more, which personally, I think is absolutely insane. Apart from that, though, I think I agree with some of this. While Supersonic Warriors did improve upon the first game in a bunch of different ways in terms of added mechanics and a bit more of a fleshed out story mode concept, though it's been a while, I do think I enjoyed the first game more. I could be misremembering maybe, but I do feel like Supersonic Warriors 2 controls a little bit clunkier than the first game. I think I remember it being a bit more responsive than this. Not to say that this feels bad, but I guess it just doesn't necessarily feel good either. It just feels fine. It feels okay. As far as the sprite criticism, I totally agree. Don't get me wrong, I don't think these sprites look bad by any means, but going from the GBA to the DS, I think there could have been a little more detail here. I actually think I prefer the chunky GBA sprites to the more smoothed out DS ones. Not to mention that really cool sprite scaling effect they used in the first game. It's totally absent in Supersonic Warriors 2, taking away a lot of the depth and dynamic feeling the fights gave me in the first game. Instead, the screen does zoom out, making everything smaller if you happen to fly far away from your opponent, but that scaling that gave the impression of a Z-axis is just gone. I honestly also prefer the parallax scrolling 2D pixel backgrounds to the low poly 3D DS ones. Like, yeah, technically 3D assets are cool, I guess, but a parallax scrolling pixel art background will always look more appealing than low detail, low poly assets to me. I don't know. Another weird thing about this game is that since it's a DS game, your game saves to the actual cartridge as you make your way through it, but oddly enough, you, for whatever reason, are unable to delete your save file. You can't delete your save file. You're literally only allowed to play this game once per cartridge. This has to be some kind of oversight because I don't think I've ever come across another game that has this issue. I know they must exist, but I don't think I've personally ever played them. For that reason alone, even if you have a physical version of this game, I suggest playing it on a flash cart if you happen to own one, because at least then you can have the option to manually delete your save data if you feel like playing through the game fresh again. While I do think I enjoyed the first game more, Supersonic Warriors 2 brought some pretty enjoyable new ideas to the table that weren't present in the first game, and it's a pretty competent fighting game. Maybe not mechanically in terms of it being a well-designed fighting game, like you're not going to find this at EVO, but it's got a good amount of content and it's an overall pretty enjoyable Dragon Ball game. Hold on to your hats, folks, because this next one is completely out of my wheelhouse and the only one I probably will struggle most with trying to talk about. Anyway, here it goes. In 2007, Bandai Namco released Dragon Ball Z I knew I was gonna do this. Dragon Ball Z Harakanuru Densetsu. I knew it. I knew when I was recording this I was gonna f it up the first time. But yeah, that's Harakanuru Densetsu. There we go. Apparently, that translates to Goku Densetsu, but I'm not 100% sure, considering the game is actually titled Dragon Ball Z Harakanuru Goku Densetsu and Goku Densetsu in Europe. So I feel like a few details are being left out here, and I still don't know what Harakanuru means. So someone in the comments, help. In any case, it's a card-based RPG that takes place from the beginning of the Saiyan saga to the end of the Cell saga. This is another game where there's separate campaigns for each different characters, all telling the Dragon Ball Z era story from each respective character's perspective. The 4 campaigns are Goku, Gohan, Piccolo, and Vegeta, but Vegeta needs to be unlocked, and I didn't play far enough in the game to play as him, because if I had, this video was never going to come out. Much like my buddy Scott, I'm not an RPG guy. For the most part. There are some exceptions. It's not a rule. I'll play Pokemon and a few others, but most RPGs are just way too long for me, and I can't imagine ever getting videos out if I were to fully cover RPGs, but I digress. Now, what separates this game from a lot of other ones where you have separate character campaigns, you can't play as one character, finish, and move on to the next. Eventually, whichever character you're playing as will hit a wall where you can no longer progress, and the only way to advance the story is by switching to another campaign and completing stages which have been unlocked for other characters. And I assume this is why Vegeta is locked at the start. You must not be able to experience his timeline in the story until you've reached it, which actually does make a lot of sense. This also makes it so you actually play through the game as the other characters. It would be very easy, especially for myself, just to play as Goku, beat it as Goku, and be done with it. This setup, though, forces you to experience each campaign to actually complete the game, and I think that's a clever idea. Now onto the actual gameplay. As I said, it's a card-based RPG, and I was actually super anxious about writing this segment because for a pretty long time, I really was not understanding the rules of the game. If a game gives me a proper tutorial and holds my hand till I learn, I usually don't have too hard of a time wrapping my head around these kinds of things, but Since card games really aren't my thing, and instead of a proper tutorial, the game just kind of throws a bunch of text at you at the beginning of the game and then just says, okay, have fun, buddy. I did not, in fact, have fun, buddy. I was kind of just flying by the seat of my pants for quite a while, completely left to my own devices and just hoping I would manage to figure out the rules and mechanics through experience. This took much longer than expected. 98% of the time, I wasn't understanding what cards to play and what effect they had, because not only was it rough to grasp in general, but cards do completely different things depending on whether you're on the main map screen or when you're in battle, so it's very confusing for me. Eventually, though, I figured it out for the most part, and it's honestly not too bad. It's relatively simple once it's understood. It just took me forever to understand it. It's somehow simultaneously simple and convoluted, but the gist of it is, each card has a few symbols on it. A Dragon Ball, an effect symbol, and a defense number. The stars on the Dragon Ball represent the card's attack power. The number is the defense, and the effect can be one of 8 different effects which can range from strike, which is used to attack, to more passive effects like the use card, which allows you to use an item. If either the attack power or defense power shows a Z, that represents the number 8, which is the highest. Now, on the map, which is basically like a playing board as the game is set up like that of a board game, the attack number is the amount of spaces you move, and the defense number basically determines whether or not you'll need to fight a random encounter battle once you move. If your defense is higher than the random enemy's attack, you'll skip the battle and continue on to the next turn. If you lose, though, that's one of the situations where you'll need to actually fight, and the rules for the cards change during battle. In battle, each turn is a mini-duel. You play a card, and if your card's attack power is higher than your opponent's, you initiate whichever card you played's effect is. To attack, you need to pick a strike card, one of the friend cards where another character helps you, some of which attack and some don't, or you need to use the reverse card, which flips the stats of your card with your opponent's. If you happen to lose on a turn, though, your defensive number is then what comes into play. If your defense is higher than your opponent's attack, you'll guard, and only take minimal damage. If it's less than your opponent's attack, you'll take X amount of hits, however many over your defense it is. So, for example, if you use a number 4 defense card and your opponent's attack is 6, you'll take 2 hits. There are some new mechanics that start to pop up, like combining cards with matching defense numbers, but that's basically the crux of how the game operates. As you play, you'll unlock little things like cards you can view in a gallery, as well as voice lines for each character, but that's pretty much the game. Like I said, I'm not an RPG guy, and I'm certainly not a card game guy, but I did have some fun with this one. I'll admit, playing it for the sake of covering it for a video kind of sucks the fun out of it a bit, but this is definitely a game that if I had played it at the time it came out, I totally could have gotten into it. From what I can tell, it's not super hard, and once you figure out the rules, it's actually pretty decent. Oh, and the music is also surprisingly good. Hey, real quick, if you're watching this and you're liking what you see, consider subscribing. I know you've heard this a million times, but swimming against the YouTube algorithm's current is quite difficult, and when you guys actually sub, it really does make a big difference. So, if you want to see more of what I do, think about tapping that button. That's all I gotta say. In 2008, Bandai Namco and Atari in the US would publish a game by a studio I personally have never heard of called Game Republic. This time, instead of focusing on the Dragon Ball Z portion of the story like most games tend to, this would go back to the beginning, telling the story of Dragon Ball from the start. Dragon Ball Origins is an interesting game. It's not exactly bad, but it's also not exactly good either. This time around, instead of a fighting game or an RPG, Dragon Ball Origins is more of an isometric action-adventure game. It has a lot of typical fare for the genre, like items, collectibles, puzzles, bosses, all not super interesting, but not egregious either. The problem here is that the entire game is bogged down by the fact that it uses stylus controls. When booting up the first stage, which is essentially the tutorial level, the game explains to you that basically every single thing in this game needs to be controlled using the stylus. Menu navigation, movement, cutscene dialogue, combat, the small bit of a HUD this game has, the list goes on. Unfortunately, it's not really completely accurate. Turns out you can actually do some of this with the DS's buttons and D-pad. You can actually use the D-pad to move as well as the L button to switch your attack mode, something supposed to be relegated to touching the HUD. You can also use the buttons to scroll dialogue. These couple things help immensely. Unfortunately, not nearly enough to fix what I think is a game that's kind of a chore to play. A lot of this game consists of navigating through corridors, solving relatively rudimentary environmental puzzles, broken up by bits of combat, sometimes skippable, but sometimes mandatory. As the game progresses, you learn more and more combat skills, which are sometimes applicable to solving certain puzzles, but it all involves different maneuvers that need to be made with the stylus, and it doesn't take long for it to get a little convoluted and overwhelming. Now, when you need to use these new techniques to solve puzzles, that's fine. Cumbersome, but fine. It's mainly an issue when you want to actually or need to use this technique in battle. Partially because they get hard to remember, and partially because the DS's touchscreen isn't exactly the most sensitive touchscreen in the world. Most people know this, but the DS's touchscreen is resistive as opposed to capacitive, meaning you don't just touch the screen. You need to actually press on the screen with a bit of force, which, for lots of applications that aren't time-sensitive, like menu navigation, it's fine. But for instances where you need to make quick inputs, it's easy to accidentally not make inputs when you intend to, especially in situations where you aren't just supposed to wildly tap at the screen and actually need to execute specific movements with the stylus. All this to say, most of the time, it's a lot safer to just spam the regular attack in this game, which only requires you to tap an enemy. As I said, there's different combat modes, and while I didn't beat the game and I'm unsure of if more gets unlocked, I had 2. I'm pretty sure it stays at 2, but just don't quote me on that. Basic hand combat and the power pole. Naturally, punches require close combat, and the power pole can attack from a distance, so the safest bet is usually to keep your distance and attack from afar. Now, I don't think the game is all bad by any means. The character models all look pretty good, the music is okay, and there's tons of cutscenes, all 3D modeled, which is more than I'd typically expect for a DS game. It's broken up by 4 main levels and unlockable sub-chapters for each level that aren't mandatory. Now, some of these chapters are surprisingly quick, only taking a minute or 2, and some can be extremely long, an extremely long slog. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason between the lengths of stages. As I said, most stages consist of navigating corridors, solving puzzles, and fighting. Sometimes these are pretty linear, and sometimes they're very much not linear, but for the most part, it's just a whole lot of running around and making sure Bulma doesn't die, because she likes to run ahead of you and get herself into trouble. This isn't every stage. Sometimes you do go through a stage solo, but the ones with Bulma do get a little irritating, because she tends to run ahead and get attacked by enemies. She can defend herself, but it's a toss-up on how her AI is going to work, so you really can't trust her running off by herself and tend to need to swoop in to save her. Honestly, a lot of the environmental puzzles actually consist of helping her get through a stage since she can't just cross gaps like Goku, so a lot of times you need to do things like move giant rocks to create a bridge for her. This game is very heavy on the escort mission stuff. The game does occasionally change things up a little bit, like the Nimbus Cloud stages where you need to use the stylus to control Goku in the air, speeding up, slowing down, and evading hazards. These actually weren't too bad. Normally, I'm not into changes of pace like this in games, but that's also because I typically like the core gameplay in the game that I'm playing and would rather not deviate from it. In Dragon Ball Origins, however, it's definitely a bit of fresh air. Now, I don't want to say this game is all bad. It's definitely not. And for kids, yeah, I may have enjoyed this when I was young, but as an adult, the game just doesn't offer enough for me to deal with the cumbersome touch controls for more than a few hours. As a kid, I had that kind of patience, but now I don't have the kind of free time to put up with this much monotony in exchange for a little bit of charm. I mentioned earlier that I'm not really into RPGs, but as I said, it's not a hard rule and there are definitely exceptions. And to my surprise, Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans is one of those exceptions. Normally, my expectations for Dragon Ball games aren't super high, since quality is seemingly all over the place, but considering the game was actually developed by Monolith Soft, it's unsurprising that this one turned out to be a standout. Released in 2009 and published by Bandai Namco, it's a turn-based RPG, again following the events of Dragon Ball Z. But wait, this time it's actually different. I can hardly believe it, but somehow, by some miracle, this one doesn't start with Raditz. Now, if the title didn't give it away, obviously we do eventually get there, and it all comes to a head with the fight against Vegeta. But this time around, they actually start us off during the tail end of the original Dragon Ball storyline with the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai arc. So as far as the anime run goes, technically still part of the Dragon Ball portion of the story, but with Goku as an adult. I actually really prefer this over the typical beginning with Raditz. Sure, you never get the full picture without actually making your way through Dragon Ball, but I think the arc prior sets up a lot of the pieces that are completely absent when starting off the story with Raditz, so the extra content is welcomed here. So as I said, a big portion of the beginning of this game is comprised of events that came before Goku and Piccolo's fight against Raditz. So for a lot of people who may have only watched the Dragon Ball Z portion, there's a lot of story here that players, especially at the time the game came out, may not have experienced. You start the game out with a party of 3. Krillin, Tien, and Yamcha, and after a few quick chapters, Goku joins you. It's set up like a traditional old-school JRPG, with an overworld map, areas to explore with items to find, random encounters, boss fights, the works. The cutscenes are also pretty well written, and all the pixel art is surprisingly good. Not that I expect it to be bad or anything, but in my opinion, it's all noticeably high quality. And there's more cutscenes that I would expect too, at least for an RPG of this kind. Now, combat in an RPG is super important. A lot of times it makes or breaks the game. You can have the most engaging story in the world, but if I hate the battle system, I'm not going to want to play the game. Probably the only exception I really ever made was Paper Mario: The Origami King, and as much as I liked that game, the battle system nearly killed it for me. Luckily, Attack of the Saiyans actually has a pretty fun, albeit basic, battle system, which, funny enough, has an element that's not dissimilar to Paper Mario and other games like South Park: The Stick of Truth. Instead of it just being a game of mindlessly trading blows, Attack of the Saiyans adds something that nearly always sells an RPG battle system for me. A mechanic that requires real-time button inputs from the player, this time in the form of what the game calls active guard. Now, it may not go as far as other games do, and it's relegated to only blocking, but when an enemy is ready to attack, a sound cue and graphic pops up on whichever party member is about to be attacked, and if you press the button at the correct time, you mitigate a chunk of the damage. Now, I didn't specify which button, because that's also a factor that comes into play. See, 3 of your party members can be in battle at any time, each on a different plane, top, middle, and bottom. These positions correlate to the face buttons of the DS, top being X, middle being Y, and bottom being B. When it's a one-on-one fight, it's not that difficult, but when you have multiple party members in play, you need to react quickly by not just pressing a button in time, but quickly noticing which party member is about to be attacked. So it takes quite a bit of split-second reflexes. This does get slightly less difficult as you get better, but it's a tricky little mechanic that's super rewarding once you get good at it. Each character also has a rage gauge, which is a meter that gradually fills throughout the battle. When a character's gauge is full, they go into something called sparking mode, indicated by a red aura. You can then perform an ultimate attack, or if 2 or more characters' gauges are full, they can execute a sparking combo, a combination of attacks performed when the right characters in a party are in sparking mode and the right attacks are executed on the same target. Personally though, on account of my lizard brain, I just sort of spammed Kamehamehas, but that's just me. Now, you have all your Dragon Ball versions of traditional RPG consumables, like instead of health and mana potions, you have senzu and items to replenish ki, revives, the works, but this game also has its own take on badges in the form of dino caps, which are items that can be collected, which all give different buffs or powers respectively in battle or in the overworld once equipped. The catch though is that you only have 2 slots, and they both behave differently. See, if you equip one in slot 1, that's the main dino cap you have equipped, and it functions normally. The second slot though, known as standby mode, is different, and anything equipped in slot 2 either doesn't function at full capacity or doesn't work at all, and each dino cap will tell you in its description how it behaves when in standby mode. Once again, I have yet to beat this one because it's an RPG and will take me 10 billion years, but this one really surprised me, especially after how much I didn't like the Dragon Ball RPGs on the GBA like Legacy of Goku. I actually really enjoyed what I played, and I may even continue to play it. It's a pretty simple Dragon Ball RPG, but it's engaging, fun, has rewarding mechanics, it's not frustrating to play, and that's honestly really all I ask for. Released only a couple years after the first, in 2010, a sequel to Dragon Ball Origins came out, fittingly titled Dragon Ball Origins 2, at least in the US. I'm gonna be right up front here by saying this game is so vastly better than the first that I legitimately thought it had to have been made by a different developer, but nope. Game Republic is back at the helm again, and Dragon Ball Origins 2 improves on literally every single aspect of the Dragon Ball Origins gameplay, and the whole thing is not only more fun, but just much more streamlined with less padding. First off, they ditched the isometric thing. It's still rendered in a similar 3D space, but this time it's not skewed diagonal for literally no reason. Most importantly here, and I was taken aback when I first was given the option, but the game is no longer bogged down by shitty stylus controls. You can, however, choose to use shitty stylus controls, but this time you're actually given the option to just play with regular buttons in the D-pad. This, in and of itself, drastically improves the quality of the experience, and if they had not iterated any further or fixed anything else, that would have been enough to bump the game up several points. Not to mention, the controls overall just feel more responsive in general, and they did a lot of tweaking to make this game more enjoyable to play. Like, for example, in the first game, if you wanted to swap between hand-to-hand combat and the power pole, you needed to press the L button or the touchscreen, but you couldn't just do it quickly. The game makes you come to a complete stop first before allowing you to swap, which was not only clunky, but also led to some frustrating scenarios where you either needed to take a hit or needed to run away and create space just to switch. In Dragon Ball Origins 2, you can just swap on the fly, and it streamlines the combat that much more. And the combat itself is much more fluid. In the first game, a lot of times I found myself accidentally punching the air because the game would point me in the wrong direction. I'm not sure how they did it, but the directional controls feel a lot smoother, and I found myself in way less situations like that, which increases the fluidity of the combat. Not to mention, it definitely feels like your attacks come out a little quicker. In Dragon Ball Origins 1, combat felt like a chore and a game of keep away with the staff. In 2, the combat is actually surprisingly kind of fun, albeit still a little monotonous. No more Bulma bogging you down either. There are instances later on where she comes into play, but not in an escort mission way. This time, you actually take control of some secondary characters, allowing for a little change of pace here and there, but it never overstays its welcome. Naturally, Origins 2 picks up after the events of Dragon Ball Origins, which covered the first 2 arcs of Dragon Ball, and follows the event of the Red Ribbon Army arc, which also means this game gets right into the action a lot faster. In my opinion, the beginning of the Dragon Ball story is a little slow, but since that's all out of the way in the first game, the second one doesn't have to spend as much time easing you in. The first game takes advantage of the slow start to the story by making the whole beginning of the game essentially a tutorial. In Origins 2, though, when you start off, you can head to the right for a quick tutorial explaining the controls, or to the left to get straight into the action. Overall, Origins 2 just trimmed a whole lot of the fat off the experience. They definitely learned from what they didn't get quite right in the first game. The cutscenes are just as good as the first games, if not even a little bit better, and the music, I'd say, is, while not amazing, a small step up from the first, which itself was admittedly decent. The most surprising part about this game to me is probably the difficulty. It actually took me by surprise. The majority of the game isn't particularly difficult. The levels are about on par with Origins 1 in that regard, but there's a pretty big ramp up in difficulty for the bosses specifically. They actually take skill, thought, and quick reflexes. Consumable health items that you can purchase in the shop do help, but they only help so much. You really can't spam health items and strong-arm your way through these bosses with no strategy, especially considering they're kind of pricey and the game isn't exactly liberal with its dealing out of Zenny. Some bosses are pretty straightforward. Evade attacks and get hits in when you can, and they're not really the kind of fights you want to be overzealous with, because getting greedy with your attacks will inevitably lead to you taking a hit. So you either need to get hits in and then dash away, or use some of the game's advanced techniques to dodge and counter. Some bosses take it a step further, though, and do that thing which I still have not found a name for, but that thing when you have to basically solve a little environmental puzzle to fight the boss. Happens in games like Zelda, Quake, hell, even the original Donkey Kong. This is my favorite genre of boss fight, where instead of just attacking, you need to use your surroundings to either inflict damage or cause the boss to drop its guard. In this fight, for example, the boss is too squishy to take damage, so you need to break holes in the wall of the arena to let freezing cold air in, and then knock the boss in that direction to freeze him, allowing you to deal damage. Just like in the first game, sub-levels in each chapter are unlockable, but once again, they aren't mandatory for progression. These stages are also just more well-designed in general. They aren't super involved still, and they are just a little bit monotonous, but they aren't the egregious series of corridors that the first games are. Dragon Ball Origins 2 is leaps and bounds better than the first game, and while it's not necessarily one of the best DS games I've ever played, it's genuinely enjoyable, and I really did not like the first game very much. If you've played the first game, didn't like it, and then never picked up 2 because of that, I would say to give this one a shot. And if you've never played either, you should probably just skip the first one and go straight to 2. It has all the charm of the first game, maybe even more so, but without the cavalcade of issues that bogged it down. Here's one you may not have heard of. If you're a super dedicated fan, I'm sure this isn't new to you, but if you really only grew up watching Dragon Ball and playing the games and didn't get into a bit of a further obsession, this one may have flown under your radar. Why? Well, because nobody outside of Japan ever got it. Game Republic would be at the helm of one final DS Dragon Ball game, but this time around, instead of an adventure, it would be a traditional fighting game, albeit with the inclusion of some unconventional mechanics. Not only that, but this game wouldn't be under the Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z title, but rather the Dragon Ball Kai name. Some of you may be familiar with its follow-up for the 3DS, Extreme Butoden, which itself, funny enough, uses 2D sprites, whereas the DS release, Dragon Ball Kai Ultimate Butoden, has fully 3D modeled characters and cutscenes. Once again, we have a fighting game that, to no one's surprise, follows the events of the Z portion of the Dragon Ball story. Once again, starting with Raditz and ending with Buu. But this time, there's some deviation that I think shakes things up a little bit. Not only do you unlock an extra chapter following Bardock, but there are tons and tons of branching what-if scenario paths as well as sub-chapters. You never really need to actually play these to get through the game, but these aren't just one-off levels. You actually unlock full paths for said scenarios multiple times per chapter. There's surprisingly a lot of meat here. Now, all the cutscenes are all well animated and there's a lot of them, but unfortunately, well, as I said, the game was only ever released in Japan, so I can't read any of them. For the main story, I mean, this is fine. Not only have I watched Dragon Ball Z multiple times in multiple different forms, but I've also played so many Dragon Ball games that the story is burned into my brain, so not understanding the dialogue here is fine. I basically know what they're saying. It's in the what-if scenarios where this becomes an unfortunate pain. Outside of visually trying to deduce what's happening in these stories, I don't actually have any idea what's going on. Now, I bet some of you are probably asking, well, isn't there an English patch for the game? And my answer to that would be yes, sort of, but not really. See, what I'm playing right now is the English patch, but it's very incomplete and really only translates some of the menu descriptions and special moves, and that's about it. Most moves are not translated. Even the menu weirdly converts back to Japanese at random, and I'm not sure what causes it. No dialogue is translated, and while this patch does help out just a tiny bit, I mostly had to hold my phone up to the screen with Google Translate fired up to navigate a lot of this or figure out my way through the tutorial so I could understand this game's mechanics. And while I'm still not 100% on them, I figured it out enough to play through a good chunk of the game. It has your typical light and heavy attacks as well as a throw and then a block by not pressing anything. Ultimate Butoden is basically a game of rock, paper, scissors in this regard, and it's pretty much a matter of mixing things up and not repeating things too much. Except that's not really how it is in practice. See, this is where the super moves come in, which you have two options of how to go about using. Now, you can learn all the inputs and input them manually like a traditional fighter, or you can just select them from the touchscreen. Obviously, in terms of efficiency, if you wanted to get really good at the game, learning the button inputs would be best, but for a casual player just going through the main game, it's much easier to just select them from the touchscreen. Now, I say the game doesn't want you to be repetitive and predictable in concept, but in practice, you're really better off spamming your ultimate attack. Each character has an ultimate attack, which, once initiated, triggers a little mini-game. The easiest one being this one where you just need to time your button presses. Your opponent then gets a chance to defend, and if they don't rack up enough points to defend against your attack, you deal a devastating amount of damage to their health bar. Now, this would be fine if you could only use it once per match, but in most matches I found myself being able to fire this off at least 3 times, doing most of the work of the fight for me. There were a few instances where I didn't want to be cheap and actually wanted to get some decent gameplay recordings, but whenever I did that, this allowed my opponent the opportunity to use their ultimate attack, so it just doesn't really make any sense to not spam it. Outside of that, though, I do have to admit that once I got used to the controls, despite being a little repetitive, the combat was actually kind of fun. I'm not sure why. This shouldn't be the case, but I did really start to like it. Ultimate Butoden also has a character customization section as well. I admittedly didn't unlock a whole lot of options, but this is basically a whole customization menu dedicated to cosmetics, and you can change the looks of any of the fighters in the game, assuming you unlock them first. There's also various training modes, tutorials, a 2-player option, all the typical fare you'd expect to see in a fighting game. Dragon Ball Kai Ultimate Butoden isn't an amazing fighting game by any means, in terms of its mechanics, but it has a ton of story to experience, so many fighters, some really good music, and it's got way more content than I expected it to. It's really a shame it never came out outside of Japan, and I'm not sure why it didn't, but this is honestly a bit of a standout on the DS in terms of Dragon Ball games, and I think anyone who's never checked it out should give it a shot. And that's all of them. Like I said before, I was sort of passingly familiar with the games released for the GBA, but I honestly had no idea there were this many that came out for the DS, and even more surprising to me is just how many of them were honestly pretty good. If you happen to watch the GBA video I did, I wasn't super impressed with those games, and while I wouldn't say it's a particularly stellar lineup when it comes to the DS, there's definitely a stinker here and there, but it was an improvement, and I'd say most of these are at least above average. And even what I would consider the lowest point, Dragon Ball Origins, was pretty much totally fixed in its follow-up, so even that one got a bit of a redemption. And Attack of the Saiyans really did surprise the hell out of me. That's a genuinely good RPG that I could see myself playing till the end, which says a lot. Once again, coming from someone who typically doesn't get sucked into RPGs very easily. Overall, I think the Dragon Ball representation was at least moderately strong on the DS, and a lot of these games don't really get talked about as much as they maybe should, in my opinion anyway. My takeaway here is that if you've never played any of these, definitely give Origins 2 and Attack of the Saiyans a shot. And if you're one of the many people who have never played or even knew about Ultimate Butoden, that's another strong one to check out. Anyway, that'll be it for this one. Next up is the 3DS games. I'm sure I'll get to those eventually. Oh boy. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.